We've actually travelled about 270,000 miles across Africa in 40 different countries, in the Sahara by camel caravan, in the Omo River Valley by mule train, by sailing dhow across the East African coast, and on foot in many different areas. We'd like to take you to one of the most remote corners of Africa.
Good evening, everyone. Angela and I would like to welcome you all warmly to our presentation tonight at National Geographic Live. Tonight, we're gathered here to celebrate the launch of our new book on the Dinka, the legendary cattle keepers of Sudan. Of all of the pastoral peoples across the continent that we've worked with over 30 years, the Dinka remain closest to our hearts. Sudan is the largest country in Africa and roughly 1/4 the size of the United States. It's also the most challenging terrain that we've ever worked in. For each of our Dinka trips, we would drive a vehicle from Nairobi, Kenya, fully stocked with all of the food, the fuel, the spare parts that we would need for a stay of 5 weeks. And when we arrived in Sudan, we faced another challenge, and that is finding the Dinka cattle camps scattered in the vast swamplands of the River Nile, the largest swampland in the world.
Even before we went to southern Sudan in the 1970s, we've actually been fascinated by the Dinka. They have some of the most beautiful body beadwork. They have wonderful courtship ceremonies. But above all, we were really taken by their extraordinary relationship with their cattle. Once every year, for 4 months, the Dinka actually take their animals down to the swamplands to graze. This is a time when young people leave the old people behind in the villages and go on their own with the animals. It's also a chance for young people to get to know one another. They actually spend their time down on the swamplands, grazing their animals during the day and sleeping beside them at night. The Dinka say that of all the people in Africa, they are the most devoted to their animals, and their cattle they see as the most beautiful cattle in the world. They live off their milk, they sleep on their hides, and they actually believe that these animals are their spiritual link to God. Dinka men wear colourful beaded corsets that actually indicate their progression in life. These corsets are literally tied onto the body at the front, and they're never taken off except to be removed, to be replaced by another corset, which indicates they're going into a new age grade. The man on the right here wearing the pink corset is actually 15 to 25 years old, whereas the man on the left with the yellow corset is indicating that he's nearly 30 and ready for marriage. The size of a man's corset is revealing to every young girl the number of cattle that his family have, and also the number of cattle they would be willing to pay for this young girl's hand in marriage. This is probably the most beautiful corset we've ever seen in Dinka land, and it's the only one that we've ever seen being worn by a woman. The height of this corset at the back was extraordinary, and it was revealing that her family wanted 80 head of cattle for her hand in marriage. Carol and I have often wondered about the origin of the corset. Where did this design come from? Was it the early 19th century travelers coming up the River Nile? Maybe the wife of Sir Samuel Baker, who was highly fashionable and had an incredible wasp waist? Or were they the people inspiring the Dinka, or were the Dinka, in turn, actually inspiring the early travelers with their incredible beaded corsets that really shaped their extraordinary physiques.
The Dinka dry season cattle camps offer a time and place for young people to meet in freedom. Sexual matters are discussed quite openly, but behavior is extremely innocent. For a girl to become pregnant out of wedlock is absolutely taboo and would seriously hamper her chances of finding a proper husband. The Dinka, who are up to 7'6" tall and covered with white ash, were referred to as the gentle or ghostly giants by the early explorers. But they, however, call themselves Monijang, which means the men of all men, and they are indeed the tallest race on the African continent. When a girl reaches 17 to 18 years old, her family considers that she's ready for marriage. They fatten her up to look attractive, and they veil her femininity with an alluring beaded bodice. These beaded bodices are meticulously crafted by the girl's mother and given to her at the time of marriage, later to be handed down to a younger sister. If you look closely at the center band of this corset, you see that there are a number of cowrie shells studding it. These shells are believed to promote fertility and assure that a girl will have a child within the first few years of marriage.
At puberty, a man receives a namesake ox. This is a very particular ox. He's not only named after him, but this is his personality ox. He actually believes at this stage that he and the animal are one. This animal is the completion of his personality. He takes this animal everywhere with him, and he even takes him when he's courting young girls. At this stage, he sings songs extolling the beauty of this young girl, but also songs praising the magnificence of his ox, this huge, powerful, and virile beast, which he, of course, believes is himself. He's trained his horns since calfhood, and he's powdered them with ash. He also hangs cowtail tassels from the very tip of them, of the horns, and this is an extra beautification during the courtship period. Every day when we're in the cattle camps, we watched thousands of animals being taken out to graze. The white bulls are the Dinka's favorite color, but then we realized there's hundreds of recognized colors for bulls, and each has its tiny distinction. What we enjoyed was watching Dinka elders during the day spending hours discussing their bulls' markings, and they would do it with such reverence and detail. We thought, this is just how we discuss a fine work of art in the West. One day when the animals were out grazing, we actually saw two Dinka men holding their arms in the shape of the horns of their favorite bulls. And we looked at them and we thought, what is happening here? And then suddenly we saw them approach a young girl who was ready for marriage.
This young girl was named Yom. She had just turned 17, and she'd just been given a beaded bodice by her mother, indicating that she was ready for courtship. Her two suitors took turns leaping as high as they could in front of her, trying to captivate her attention. And she, in turn, would dance with each one of them, carefully studying their intentions. Angela and I could see that she was clearly attracted to one over the other. However, we knew that despite this attraction, the man who had the most cattle would be the man who would win her hand in marriage. He would be able to afford the high bride price required by her parents to give away their daughter.
During the dry season, the Dinka move their cattle camps quite frequently. They do this because they're searching for new pasture for their animals. Now, often they had to cross tributaries of the Nile, and sometimes these tributaries were so deep that we couldn't take the vehicle across and we had to turn back. At other times, we were lucky and we found a dugout canoe. At this stage, we would cross the river by canoe and then follow the Dinka on foot. The only problem here is what to do with our vehicle. And we had to take the risk. We left the vehicle with what we hoped was a trusty herdsman, crossed the river, and then sometimes came back, maybe 4 or 5 days later, praying that the vehicle with all our equipment in was still intact. And every single time we found the same trusty herdsman sitting by the Dinka, sitting by the car at least, and we thought to ourselves, these Dinka are really amazing. They were patient, tolerant, and extremely trustworthy. As we watched the river crossings, we would often see herdsmen carrying the baby calves across, protecting them from the deep, swift-flowing waters. While the herdsmen looked after all the young animals, the women are responsible for the children. But being in Africa, this wasn't where a woman's responsibility finished. Women were in fact responsible for carrying the entire community's possession from camp to camp. They would very carefully wrap up all the cooking pots and the personal items in their hide sleeping mats, put them on their heads, and carry them from camp to camp, often very many miles apart. As the dry season grew to an end, we often saw many Dinka herdsmen come together and start what we called wild fishing frenzies. This is a time when the Dinka herdsmen take their spears and catch the fish that are caught beneath the swamps. The reason for this is they're looking for a supplement to their milk diet. The milk is getting less and less, and the fish was an important supplement. The Dinka would take the fish, but they would never be called fishermen. They used to say, we're not fishermen. Fishermen are poor and weak. We're herdsmen, and herdsmen are tall, strong, and sturdy. At this time, Dinka form small groups around clumps of grass, and at a signal, they actually raise their spears high in the ground, and as they close in their circle, they stab the grass repeatedly, catching absolutely everything as they go.
Sometimes, quite by accident, they would spear monitor lizards, which you see here, or even pythons. And when a boy would catch a monitor lizard, he would say, the fatty substance of this creature is highly nutritional to build the strength of newborn calves. Angela and I would spend hours sitting along the banks of the rivers or by the watering holes, watching children collect water hyacinth flowers and fashion fantastic masks and headdresses, and then present themselves to us to photograph. The Dinka are very possessive about their animals. They will rarely kill an animal. They will sometimes exchange them to pay for brides, to win women for their hands in marriage, and occasionally they'll sacrifice an animal to receive a blessing from God. When they sacrifice animals, they do so in shrines which are deep in the bush. And at these sites, one sees many cattle horns carved from the trunks of trees. The Dinka would explain to us that these cattle horns are believed to be their direct link into the spirit world. Following our first visits to the Dinka in the late 70s and early 80s, the Dinka fell victims to a 30-year civil war between the Islamic North and the animist and Christian South. During this time, 2 million Dinka were killed and 4 million southern Sudanese displaced. Many of the Dinka were taken to the United States and became known as the Lost Boys of Sudan. In 2005, a peace treaty was signed between the Islamic North and Christian animist South. The borders reopened, and Angela and I immediately returned. But everywhere, the tragedy of war had left its mark. Villages were bombed, roads were mined, and the Dinka had virtually lost their unique creative identity. Their beautiful body beadwork had been replaced with Kalashnikov rifles and often with Western clothes.
After the war, it became more and more difficult to find the Dinka dry season cattle camps. The last trip that Carol and I did to southern Sudan in 2007 was one of the most grueling trips we've ever done in Africa. We traveled for a month on the swampland, and we traveled skirting mined roads, driving over potholed boggy terrain and through 12-foot elephant grass of the swamps. The temperatures each day ranged from 100 to 120 degrees, and the only shade in the midday hours was under the sump of a car. We actually never kept a diary. We couldn't even make our minds think. It was so hot. However, when we were just about to turn back, we came across the most unforgettable sight. This is a Dinka dry season cattle camp with 2,000 head of cattle. And this was a camp that still held the very essence of Dinka traditional life. The camp really held a beauty for us, and we were just taken at the view at sunset, the layers of smoke that lay across the camp, and the silhouettes of the herders with their cattle and their lyre-shaped horns. Every night we would watch the gentle Dinka bring their animals in from grazing. They tether them and then they would rub their horns and caress them for several hours and rub their bellies with ash. Young children had actually been scraping dry cattle dung into conical mounds during the day. This cattle dung fuels the fires at night, and these fires fill the camp with smoke that actually keeps the mosquitoes at bay. The fires burn down to ash in the morning, and then the young Dinka boys apply the ash to their skin to further protect themselves from not just mosquitoes, but also from tsetse flies. What touched us throughout our stay and time with the Dinka was their incredible bond with their animals. In the early mornings, we'd walk into the camp, and there we'd find children still cuddled up round the conical fires, and they were cuddled up with their dogs, their calves, and their goats. These creatures were their closest members of the family.
Every age grade in the cattle camp has its own duties and responsibilities. Early in the morning, we would watch the young boys go out to milk the goats, often with a young kid competing for the milk. And sometimes we would even see the boys sucking directly from the udder of a cow as a quick way to quench their thirst. One morning, we came out and saw 4 boys leap onto the body of one of the herders, all eager to be photographed by our digital cameras. And we were amazed when we realized that this 7'6" herder was so easily able to bear their weight, and that his sweet Dinka nature tolerated the load. The children were absolutely fearless of the animals, often 2 or 3 times their size. They'd grown up with the animals. They would climb on branches to caress their horns. They would crawl underneath them to rub their bellies. The boys were in fact named after the bulls, and the girls were named after the cows. Every aspect of the animal is valued. When a cow lifts its tail, one sees the young girls race out to collect the fresh cow urine, which they use to wash their bodies when water is scarce or contaminated. The Dinka would tell us that fresh cow urine was considered a natural antiseptic. We would sometimes see the oval facial design of a young girl being delineated with cow urine in contrast to the white ash skull cap design applied to her head. The men would powder their hair with ash, and they would also dye their hair with a number of applications of cow urine over a period of months. The Dinka believe that a reddish golden colored hair is a true sign of beauty, and that if a man leaves his hair black, it's believed that he's in a period of mourning. Dinka elders are believed to hold the wisdom of the clans and are responsible for handing down the age-old beliefs to the next generation. The Dinka say that even though cattle represent wealth, all men and women are seen as equal. To be a chief, one must be kind and generous, gentle and virtuous.
When it came time to leave the Dinka cattle camps behind, we realized how incredibly privileged we'd been to experience these traditional lifestyles firsthand, where people actually treat each other as equals. They feel at one with themselves and in harmony with their land and animals. In the beauty of the cattle camp and in the presence of these generous and loving people, somehow our senses had become opened and our awareness heightened. It was like being in a completely different environment. We had become so connected with the Dinka that it was really impossible to leave.
Angela and I realized that the Dinka lived in a fragile utopia, faced with a 30-year struggle for peace. It is our hope that the future of the Dinka will allow them to sustain their ideals of unity and harmony, and that these deep-rooted values will be conveyed to the world at large. We hope also that our book will be part of this process, bringing awareness of these exceptional people to the outside world and supporting them during this extraordinary period in their history. In January 2011 of this year, the people of Southern Sudan successfully voted to become an independent nation. This was the first important step in their long sought-after quest for peace.
We'd like to thank you all very much for coming this evening. It's really great to see you all here, and particularly after so many years. For us, it's also wonderful to share some of the extraordinary experiences we've had whilst recording African ceremonies. We realize that having spent over 30 years in Africa, what a privilege we have had, and how much we've learned from the ancient cultures of Africa. The benefit of knowledge being passed from one generation to another, the importance of community, of growing up in a community, and of elders being an active part of the community and sharing their wisdom. The values of rites of passage, which help define and teach us what is expected of us at each stage of life. And the importance of ceremony that keeps us in balance with our environment and in touch with our own inner world. Every time Carol and I come back from Africa, we think there are so many of these great values missing from the Western world. Due to the ever-increasing chaos and conflict in the world, and in the light of what's been happening in the last 10 years, we believe that it's become even more important to understand the ancient cultures of the world and their humanness on a worldwide level. One of the great things that we've learned from Africa, one of the many great things, is that although we appear physically very different, either naked or dressed, scarified or made up, lip-plated or veiled, we're actually all the same human beings with similar human emotions and similar human needs. Understanding each other's cultures, celebrating our similarities and celebrating our differences is not only essential to the evolution of humankind, but we believe paramount to the pursuit of world peace.